It's wonderful. It's beautiful outside today.
Oh, good.
How's LA?
A little overcast right now, but that's usual. It'll brighten up in a little while.
Well, uh, let's get to it. I'm just
Okay,
going to start with a quick intro, if that's okay.
sure, absolutely.
So, good morning. My name is Aaron Zilbermann. I'm with Dallas Weekly, and I have the pleasure to be speaking with Sheldon Epps today. Sheldon is one of the all-time most influential African-American theater leaders, as well as a prolific director of television. He's developed major productions on and off Broadway, in London, and at many theaters across America. In addition, he's had an active and prolific television career. He was the artistic director of the renowned Pasadena Playhouse for 2 decades and currently serves as the senior artistic advisor at the historic Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. It is such a pleasure to be speaking with you today. Seriously, thank you for taking the time. When I was asked to do this interview, I was super excited. I'm very familiar with your work, and yeah, so I really appreciate this opportunity.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you. And after all of those credits, I'm a little tired, but that's okay.
So you've recently published a book, My Own Directions, A Black Man's Journey in the American Theater.
Yes.
And it's a memoir, correct?
Yeah, it's a memoir. It deals largely with all of the things that led me to become artistic director of Pasadena Playhouse, and then, as you mentioned, my 20 years there. But my career before, first as an actor and then as a director, and then my time at the theater. Yeah.
Okay. I will say I'm going to sit down and read it. I started reading it. Like as soon as they gave me this task, I started breezing through it. And first of all, I have to say it's very the way you write is incredibly engaging. So
thank you. I
it
appreciate that.
immediately grasped my attention. So I have to say that.
Thank you.
And I'm so curious to hear about, so some of the defining moments in your early career and what led you to take the different paths that you took. What took you to the Pasadena Playhouse?
Well, it goes way back. It goes way back to moving from Los Angeles, from an all-Black community in LA to the East Coast, right outside of New York City and Teaneck, New Jersey, where I was sort of a stranger in a strange land, I guess is a good way to say it, because I was suddenly in a predominantly white Jewish community. And that was a bit of a culture shock, as you can imagine, for a 10-year-old kid, and hearing new languages and new customs and new holidays and all of that. So I was really shaken for a loop. And one of the things that the upside of it was that I was, with my mother, able to go and see Broadway musicals. And that was sort of a bright spot in that transition. And eventually drifted towards being in the drama club and deciding to become an actor and going to Carnegie Mellon University, where I studied acting, not directing, and acting for several years after college, pretty successfully, but somewhat unsatisfyingly, because I didn't feel I had any control as an actor. So I started a theater company with friends that I'd been at Carnegie with. And that led to directing, and then directing on Broadway and the West End and all over the country, including in Houston frequently.
Which theater company in Houston did you work with?
Well, actually, my first job out of college was at the Alley Theater I acted at the Alley Theater several times when I was still an actor. Then I worked at Tuts, the musical theater in Houston, and just did a play in Houston. I just did a play at AD Players called Miss Maud. But it was all that regional theater experience that eventually led me to Pasadena Playhouse as artistic director.
Okay. I have to say I'm a little curious about the culture shock that you went through.
Yeah.
I find personally, the Black Jewish interaction relationship in this country to be a very unique and complicated relationship. And I read in part of your book, you mentioned at one point picking up some new languages, like some new words like chutzpah.
Tourist, chutzpah,
and then you had the chutzpah to show up as the one Black kid to audition for a play, and
right.
You ended up getting the lead for that play, and I'm curious what your experience level was. Did you feel accepted, and how was that? How was that experience? How did that experience impact you? Did you feel that you had to prove yourself beyond a certain point, more so than everyone else?
Yes. Yeah. No, it's a very, very good question. First of all, I think many of us have felt, many people of color, many Black people have felt the additional pressure that you're speaking of when you're the only face of color in the room, that whether it's enforced on you or whether you enforce it on yourself, doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
The truth is that you feel like you've got to stand up for the race, that you've got to be some kind of shining example of Blackness. You can't make a mistake. If you make a mistake, then your whole race is judged by that mistake. And in some ways, I think that my time going through that in junior high school and high school really prepared me to deal with that for the rest of my life, because that's been a frequent occurrence in my life, that I've somehow been in rooms where I was the only person of color, sometimes the first person of color, or the only person, the only Black man that people had been around. So I think I came in my adult life, I came sort of equipped for that and ready for that, though it was always challenging because of that's something I dealt with in my early years and frankly had to survive. I could have collapsed under the weight of it. And as you read in the book, for a little while, I did. I woke up sick every morning, trying not to go to school, but my parents were smart enough to force me to go. And I didn't collapse. And, that prepared me for dealing with it later in life. Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, middle school and high school those are rough years.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, it very easily could have gone either way.
Yeah. You mentioned the phrase in your book, chased by race. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? What is this?
Yes. It really means that it's always there. As I said, among friends and family, we don't sit around talking about race all of the time. I don't walk around thinking about it all of the time, but it is always there. It's always there professionally. It's always there in chance encounters. It's always there in the glance that you get when you walk into a fancy store. It used to be spoken. It's not spoken as much as it used to be, but it's there. When I would walk on to the set for the first time of a show like Frasier or Friends, there were those looks that kind of said, what's this black guy doing here on this show? When I went to Pasadena Playhouse, which was very much, I would say, a white theater company,
Yeah.
there were people in the audience, people on the staff, people on the board that had that look in their eyes. So, it's something that, as I said, you don't think about it all the time, but at some place there's something on your shoulder that reminds you that it is a factor as you move through life. Your color is a factor, sometimes a wonderful factor and a reason for celebration, but it can also be a reason for caution. It can also be a reason, hopefully not for paranoia, but to have an awareness of why things happen. And I'm sometimes a person who moves through life without that awareness in the forefront of my consciousness, and something weird will happen. And as I think about it after, I'll say, oh, that was racial. That uncomfortable moment was a racial tension. So that's what I mean by chased by race. And also chased by race professionally, in that there are things that other people use your race to define and confine you to certain things that you can and cannot do, and you got to run away from that. That chases you, and you got to run away from that and define your own path, and define yourself as an artist.
Do you have any specific examples you can recall of when you felt like others were trying to define your career for you based on your race?
Yeah, I'll give you a specific one that's actually in the book. That's just sort of microcosmic of that. When I was a freelance director, and getting some success as a freelance director, I was called by an artistic director of the theater and asked if I wanted to do the play in what I call the black slot, in the February slot. And I can't remember what the play was, but it was a play I was attracted to. But I said, just out of curiosity, well, what else are you doing in your season? What are the other things in your season? And she went through the list and said this and that, and maybe it was Twelfth Night. And I said, oh, I really love Twelfth Night. That's my favorite Shakespeare play. Would you think about my doing Twelfth Night? And she said, And I said, well, is that a problem somehow? You think that's out of my range or whatever? And she said, well, no, you would do a very good job at that. But if you did Twelfth Night, that would mean that I had to have 2 black directors in the season. And I said, would it ever occur to you to posit it as a problem to have 2 white directors in the season? Has that ever crossed your mind? Would it ever cross your mind? And she was sort of stunned into silence by my pointing that out.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow.
God forbid there should be 2 black directors in a season.
Yes, that would be an issue somehow. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing, and very, very often I think it's that's difficult to deal with. What I call unconscious bias. Mm-hmm. It's not that someone looks at you and says, "Oh, you're black," and rejects you. It's that they don't see you. They don't look at you except in a black box.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I might argue that that's a little bit more conscious than a lot of what's out there. Than yes. A lot of what, I mean, there's a lot of ways that subconscious racism comes out that is much less obvious. But to me, that's for somebody to have an issue with having 2 black directors in a season.
Oh no, that's a very conscious bias.
Yeah, I mean, to me, that's incredibly conscious.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
And unfortunately, not that long ago,
yeah,
we're not talking about something that happened, in the 1940s or 1950s. This was in the latter part of the century,
yeah.
so it's recent in our history, and I dare say that it still happens. I may not be spoken, as you just mentioned, but I dare say that still happens. That Black artists are just not panoramically thought of for each and every opportunity that is out there. It's getting better. I don't deny that. It's certainly getting better, but we still got a ways to go.
So what was it like going into, I mean, this, when I, you know, 2 decades at Pasadena Playhouse, a, predominantly white theatrical community. What was that like for you? And how
Uh,
did you navigate that? And also, question on top of that, what do you feel were your greatest accomplishments there?
yeah. Well, I think the greatest accomplishment was overcoming that, was changing that. When I arrived at the theater, theater has a beautiful courtyard outside, which sort of serves as the lobby before you go into the theater. And I would frequently sit in that courtyard and be the only person of color going into the theater, the only person under 60 going into the theater. So I knew that both of those things were a short term and long range problem for the theater, and both had to change if the theater was going to thrive and indeed survive. Um, so I dealt with it, number one, by identifying the problem and saying this is not right for a major American theater in a very diverse community and a very diverse city. Um, I'm going to make a difference until they chase me away,
Mm-hmm.
So by changing the programming, changing the artists involved, marketing efforts to new audiences, reaching out to every community, to new communities who had never been at the theater before, who didn't feel comfortable coming to the theater. That's an important part of it.
That is
If you haven't had a welcome to a place for years and years and years, the first thing you have to do is to make people know they are really welcome. This is your theater too. I want you to be here. Um, so over the years, and actually rather quickly, the theater became a real model of diversity and celebrated for that, not just in the programming, although certainly in the programming, but also in the audience, and artistic directors would frequently come to the theater and say, how did you accomplish this? How did you make this happen? I wish my audience looked this way, was as diverse, including younger people, by the way, which is really important.
so that's something I've investigated a lot, been highly interested in. I mean, personally, unfortunately, I feel that theater is no longer a popular art form. Um, when I come to shows in Dallas, whether it's at the Dallas Theater Center, which is this incredible facility with
Yeah,
so much public
beautiful.
private funding, that puts on some phenomenal productions, and their programming is really trying to reach a broad audience. But typically when I go to a play in Dallas, including there, it's a very specific audience.
Yeah,
Typically it's older, white, wealthy, theater people and theater artists themselves.
yes.
I've seen
Yeah,
one tactic that the Dallas Theater Center uses is to reach out to students in
right,
DISD. So that's one way
right.
to engage. But what techniques did you use to really to bring in an audience that didn't feel safe to come or didn't
Right.
feel comfortable? Because Dallas Theater Center is located right downtown in the arts district where a lot of people don't feel comfortable going, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I acknowledge the problem, and I would say that the problem is far from in Dallas alone. It's a problem everywhere. It's a problem in New York City. When you go to, particularly when you go to the major not-for-profit theaters in New York City, you see an older white audience. When I go to some of those theaters in New York now, I'm often one of a few people of color. It is a great challenge. Number one, it's about the programming, as you just mentioned, and theaters are aware of that. But I'm not a believer in if you build it, they will come. You got to build it, and then you got to let people know that it's there.
Yeah.
You've really, in sometimes I think that outreach and marketing is as important as production at theaters. And we don't give them quite the same weight. It is just as important to get to the right audience for a play, or the specific, to say it better, the specific audiences, plural, for a play, as it is to make the play. And that's a lot of work, a lot of effort, a lot of hand holding, a lot of going to community groups, a lot of research, a lot of getting out there into the community. We can't be bastions of art on the top of the hill waiting for people to come to us. We got to go to the people first and say, please, please come into my home. And you have to do that on a consistent basis. And if you do, then finally they will come. But you've got to make that extra effort.
Absolutely.
And sending out the subscription flyer and taking an ad in the major paper doesn't do it. It's all kinds of other contact as well.
So what led you to move on? What led you to leave Pasadena Playhouse, and what led you to the Ford Theater?
Well, I was, as you said, I was at the theater for 20 years. That's a long time. It's a long time of juggling all those things that we were just talking about. But
Yeah.
Frankly, I think that's long enough for any one person to be at a theater. I just didn't want to be one of those artistic directors who stayed too long at the fair, as I call it.
Yeah.
And I certainly was aware of situations where artistic leaders stayed at the theater for long enough that people were whispering in the hallways about, when are they going to go? Who's going to tell him or her that it's time to leave? I wanted to go out while people were still a little bit unhappy, at least, that I was leaving. So, and I just think it's long enough for one person to be putting their stamp on the artistic identity of the theater. It needs to change. It needs to morph. It needs to grow into something different. So I think that's the last responsible choice you make as an artistic director, as an artistic leader, is to know when is it a good time to leave.
And what led you to Ford's Theater?
Well, directing there, I did a production of 12 Angry Men there. Had a very good relationship with the artistic team, the artistic staff. Love the theater. The physical facility is great, and there's something about the history of it that sort of enriches the experience. So I was invited. Number one, that's always a good first step, is to be invited to get involved with a place. But I felt that I wasn't interested in going into another theater where I was trying to get something started, as I did at Pasadena Playhouse. But Ford's Theater was already very involved in diversity efforts and building new audiences and broad thinking about casting of the productions and all of that. So I felt that I could help to further that work, not start it, but continue it, further it, expand it, and help it evolve. And happily, we've been doing that.
It's been a good experience so far.
Yeah, it's been a great experience. Been a tough time with COVID and all of that and shutting down. And I'm sure your experience in this in Dallas, it's hard time to get audiences to come back.
Absolutely.
But we will all do it. We have to. It's important to keep our theaters alive.
Absolutely. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts, or okay, what is your if you had to say, like, what is your major goal with this book? What do you want the industry to take away? What do you want theater artists to take away? What do you want young theater artists to take away? What do you want artists of color to take away? What's kind of your driving force with your book?
Thank you for asking. I think that we talked a little bit about it before. As an artist, period, but certainly as an artist of color, the world around you wants to define who you are and what you can do and what you can't do, and even how far you can go. And I was subject to that. Through the American theater field at the time, which is something that still exists now. But I think a combination of chutzpah and arrogance and a healthy ambition said, no, I'm not going to be defined by your standards. I'm going to define what I want. I'm going to define where I want to go. I'm going to follow my own directions, which is why I titled the book that way.
Yeah.
And I did, and fortunately was able to do almost everything that I've ever wanted to do or ever dreamed of doing in the career. So I guess I'm saying that, if this little black boy from Compton, as I begin the book, can make that happen, I believe that anybody can make it happen with drive and determination and training and hard work. So I guess I'm saying to everybody, follow your own directions. Don't be defined by others or by the world around you. Define your own world and follow your own directions.
We've clearly, in the theater world, in the theater industry, we've made a lot of progress regarding inclusion, equity. We still have a long way to go.
We do. We're still talking about it, and we still should be talking about it. It'll be great to get to the point where we don't have to talk about it anymore.
Yeah. What do you see as one of the major things that needs to be addressed that we're not quite there yet? One of the most significant things that...
Well, audience development, as you just said, that you can go into almost any theater in America right now. And if it's not a specifically ethnic theater, you will see an older white audience. So we've got to, for the survival of the art, keep it that. We've got to find a way to make it more accessible and less expensive. That would be a big help. Leadership in the theater. And when I say leadership, I mean leadership behind the scenes. Certainly we see artists of color on stage now, but still a long way to go in terms of who's running the theaters, artistically, but also on the management side, who are executive and managing directors of theaters, who are development directors of theaters, all of those other support opportunities. And then, we need to stop counting, to go back to that story I said before about, 2 Black directors. Let's just get to the point where we're all doing the work. We're all doing the work on an even playing field, and genuinely everything is being evaluated on the basis of artistry and ability rather than numbers of black faces or numbers of black plays or numbers of Latino plays. We're just doing the work that it's important to do with everybody involved who deserves to be involved.
Fascinating. Yeah. We've got a lot. We've got a long ways to go.
We do, but we'll get there. As you said, things are very much better than they were even 4 or 5 years ago. So there's hope that will continue.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your time. It was such a pleasure talking to you.
You too.
I'm looking forward to finishing this book. I've been burning through it super quickly. It's a great read.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you for having me.
Of course.
Yeah. Great to talk to you.
It's good to talk to you too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.